Hello and welcome to Baiju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 7 of the Delhi edition. This article deals with the debate that has emerged around the usage of the term union government or central government. This topic is in news because recently the state government of Tamil Nadu has issued a notification to stop using the term central government in its official communication and instead replace it with the term union government as provided under the Indian Constitution. To address this debate and to find out which term is more appropriate, we need to look for answers within the Indian Constitution and as well as we need to take a look at the proceedings of the Constituent Assembly which drafted the Indian Constitution. See, the very first article in the Constitution, that is Article 1, makes it very clear that India, that is Bharat, shall be a union of states. So clearly, the term union was preferred by our founding fathers to define India in the very first article to the Constitution. It's not just that, but the word center or central government doesn't find any mention in the Constitution, in any of the articles, or in any of the parts of the schedules. You look at all the 395 articles, the 22 parts, and the 8 schedules, you'll not come across the term center or central government. Instead, the reference made by the constitution makers is always to the union or the union government. So the constitution does not make use of the term center or the central government. But in common usage, all of us use the term center and union interchangeably. And very often we use the term union government or central government as if they mean the same. It's not just the public and the media who do this, but even our governments, even the center and the state governments, often make use of the word center or central government instead of the union or the union government. But Tamil Nadu's latest decision to use only the term union government in the place of center or central government has raised a crucial debate about the origins of this term in the constitution, and hence it becomes very important to understand the thought process which was employed by our founding fathers and our constitution makers in the Constituent Assembly while drafting the Indian Constitution. Because this debate is essentially a debate between the integrity of the nation versus protecting the federal nature of the Constitution, which happens to be one of the basic features of the Constitution. See, the Constitution makes it very clear that we have the union and the state governments. The powers of the union are clearly vested with the President of India, who is bound to act upon the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers, headed by the Prime Minister. So if students of polity, if they try to trace the origin of the term center in the Indian Constitution, they won't be finding any references. But if you go back to the General Clauses Act of 1897, there you find the definition of the central government, which refers to a highly centralized authority during the colonial rule. But if you were to infer the term in post-independent India, then the central government, for all practical purposes, would mean the president, as all the executive authority of the union has been vested with the president. Then further, if you look at the proceedings of the Constituent Assembly, in 1946, Jawaharlal Nehru introduced the aims and objects of the Assembly, where the Constituent Assembly resolved that India shall be a union of territories that are willing to join the independent sovereign republic. So clearly over here, the emphasis was on the consolidation and unification of India by the confluence of various provinces and territories. Essentially, smaller federated units were coming together to form a strong united nation. Then during these discussions within the Constituent Assembly, there was a proposal to consider the principles that were laid out under the British Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946. Under this plan, a central government was contemplated with very limited powers, whereas the provinces would have more substantial autonomy, thereby making India a loosely put together federation. But however, the developments of 1947 made the constitution makers to take note about the need to protect the integrity and the sovereignty of the nation. Because the partition of the subcontinent and the large-scale communal violence that followed, and the war in 1947, that is in Jammu and Kashmir, accompanied with resistance by several provinces and princely states to join India, made the constitution makers realize the importance of maintaining the integrity of the nation. Hence, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who was the chairman of the drafting committee, observed that India should be a union of states because the word union will negate the right of any state to secede from India. In the view of Dr. Ambedkar, India shall be a union of states, and he made it very clear that even though India was to be a federation, it doesn't mean that states have a right to secede from the union, because the Indian Union is not a result of an agreement between the federated states. This essentially makes the Indian Union indestructible, whereas the states themselves are destructible within the Union. This is in contrast to how the US Federation was formed. In the United States, the federated states came together through an agreement, and they came together to form an union with the right to secede if required. In the context of the Indian Union, the states have been provided with federalism, but they do not have the right to secede at any cost. Hence, Dr. Ambedkar and other constitution makers, they believed that the word union would be the best to describe the Indian nation, because it would uphold the integrity of the nation, as it would negate the right of the states to secede from the union. So this made the Indian Union an indestructible union. This stand of Dr. Ambedkar and other constitution makers led to few concerns within the Constituent Assembly. Leaders such as Maulana Hasrat Mohani raised concerns about the usage of this term because they interpreted this to mean the creation of a highly centralized state on the lines of a strong unified Germany, which was envisioned by Prince Bismarck and later adopted by Kaiser William and later by Adolf Hitler. A few constitution makers expressed concern about this over-centralization, but Dr. Ambedkar would go on to address these concerns as well. Dr. Ambedkar made it clear that just because India would be a union of states, that wouldn't mean that the states would be under the thumb of the center. He clarified that the states do not draw powers from the center. The states in no way are subordinate to the center. They both derive their respective powers and jurisdictions within the constitution. And in fact, the authority of one is coordinate with the authority of the other. So this clearly shows that the constitution makers were aware of the need to protect federalism at any cost while balancing the integrity and the unity of the nation. So enough measures have been taken within the constitution to prevent any over-centralization. And even though the Indian constitution displays a unitary bias, and even though it is a quasi-federal state, the states are in no way subordinate to the center. So in that regard, the usage of the term union strikes a fine balance between the need to protect the integrity of the nation by making the union indestructible, while preventing over-centralization and protecting the authority of the states by protecting the principle of federalism. Dr. Ambedkar responded to these concerns by clearly pointing out that the constitution envisions sharing of powers between the union and the state. Dr. Ambedkar repeatedly made it clear to the Constituent Assembly that the states are in no way subordinate to the union and the states do not draw their powers from the union. That is the reason why the constitution itself provides for sharing of powers between the union and the federated units. And this sharing of powers extends to not just the executive organ, but also to the judiciary and the legislature. I'm sure you might be aware of provisions in the constitution that provides for sharing of executive powers between the union and the states. Similarly, between the judiciary as well, the jurisdiction and the powers have been clearly divided between the Supreme Court and the High Courts. The High Courts, for that matter, are in no way subordinate to the Supreme Court. In fact, the High Courts enjoy a wider writ jurisdiction, and they even enjoy superintendence over the district courts and the lower courts. But the Supreme Court, on the other hand, has a narrower writ jurisdiction as compared to the High Court, and the Supreme Court doesn't enjoy direct superintendence over the High Courts. Just like the Supreme Court, the High Courts also draw separate powers from the Constitution. Similarly, the state governments draw their own jurisdiction and their own powers, and they don't essentially draw their powers from the center. You can also find this division of powers within the legislature as well, where the subjects of legislation and governance have been clearly divided into the union list and the state list, thereby marking the jurisdiction and territories of the parliament and the state legislature. But however, keeping practical considerations in mind, the Union Parliament does prevail over the state legislature if there is a conflict, and the center also does enjoy certain degree of powers over the states, which basically displays the unitary bias of the constitution. The constitution makers felt that this unitary bias was essential to maintain and protect the integrity of the nation, while the separation of powers and the usage of the term union was important to protect federalism and to prevent states from becoming the subordinate units of the center. So, in conclusion, we can say that the term center or central government was deliberately excluded by the Constituent Assembly in order to ensure that the Indian Federation doesn't display a centralizing tendency. But however, despite all these laws and provisions, eventually it all boils down to the conscience of the men and women who are in power, and it is up to them, that is the people of India and the representatives, to protect and safeguard these basic features of the Indian Constitution. Now let's take up a column from page number 7, which evaluates the blended learning model that has been proposed by the University Grants Commission for higher educational institutions. In the light of the pandemic, education in India has embraced digital learning and online learning. And to mainstream this model of learning by clubbing the benefits of online and offline education, the UGC has proposed a concept known as the blended learning model. This concept is said to be in line with the core principles of the National Education Policy of 2020. See, the three core principles of the National Education Policy are access, equity, and quality. So the editorial tries to evaluate whether this new learning model proposed by UGC is in line with the core principles of the NEP. As per this concept proposed by the UGC, higher educational institutions in the country are expected to adopt a blended learning model which offers a combination of online and offline learning. As per UGC's proposal, 40% of learning in higher educational institutions should take place through the online format, and the rest 60% should continue in the traditional offline format. As per the UGC, the adoption of such a blended learning model can bring in several benefits to both teachers and students, and as well as to the higher education sector in general. The UGC points out that adopting a combination of online and offline learning will help in improving student engagement, as online learning could be made more intuitive and more visually engaging. The UGC is of the opinion that this model could also enhance the student to teacher interaction, which otherwise is highly restricted and limited in a traditional classroom environment. This improvement in student engagement and the retention of students' interest, followed by greater student to teacher interaction, is expected to improve learning outcomes. Also, the blended learning model provides for a more flexible classroom environment where both the teachers and the students can customize their approach and lead to overall improvement in learning outcomes. This blended model also offers plenty of opportunities for institutional collaboration, wherein elite institutions can collaborate with smaller and faraway institutions. And this mode of distance learning through institutional collaboration can help in bridging the gaps in infrastructure and as well as with regard to quality teachers. Through institutional collaboration over the online format, teachers from elite institutions can extend their services to students from other smaller and remote institutions as well. Eventually, such a blended model will provide more opportunities for self-learning to the students instead of making them rely on the current spoon-fed model where self-learning and critical thinking is hardly encouraged in traditional classroom-based learning. This provides an opportunity for the teachers as well to transform themselves from just being a knowledge provider into a coach or into a mentor who can guide and nurture the abilities of the students. The UGC points out that the blended model for higher education offers numerous benefits over the traditional model. In a traditional offline format, education, especially higher education, is largely teacher driven, it is teacher directed. In a classroom environment, there is just a top down approach where the teacher is just acting as a knowledge provider and they are seen to be adopting a uniform teaching method based on the one size fits all approach. Whereas in a blended model, where both online and offline formats are blended together. The approach would be more student driven, and it provides an opportunity for bottom up learning where the teacher would be required to customize his teaching to the needs and requirements of each individual students. So based on all these probable benefits, the UGC has been pushing for the blended learning model in India's higher educational institutions. While the writers welcome this policy, they do have a word of caution for the UGC and the Government of India. They point out that such a blended learning model will present several challenges and increase the existing divides in education, and hence they offer a few suggestions and recommendations to make this policy work better by keeping in mind the core principles of the national education policy. They refer to the latest findings of the All India Survey on Higher Education, according to which nearly 61% of the higher educational institutions are located in the rural areas, and nearly 79% of them are managed privately by private institutions and private managements. The biggest challenge in adopting the blended learning model would be the cost, because this would require a lot of investment in technology and digital and internet infrastructure by the education institutions. And this higher cost can be afforded only by the big corporates who run these educational institutions. Then, followed by this, we will face the challenge of poor internet penetration in the country. As per latest data, internet penetration in the country stands at just 45%, and hence these two factors make it very clear that the widespread adoption of the blended learning model without adequate planning and without adequate allocation of resources will only widen the existing divides in education. This would be completely contradictory to the three core principles of the national education policy. The higher cost of education and the lack of internet connectivity will only further increase the existing divides in education. That includes the regional or geographic divide between colleges in rural and urban areas, because generally colleges in urban areas and well-funded institutions tend to have better infrastructure and better resources, and hence this could increase the regional and geographic divide with regard to education. The income divide in the society will also have an impact, as many students may not be able to afford expensive digital devices to access online formats of education or to afford high-speed internet. Then, not every student and not every teacher is well versed with digital devices, and this lack of digital literacy could further widen the digital divide, thereby making education more inequitable and limiting access. Then, of course, there is the question of the all round development of the student. In a traditional offline classroom environment, it was much easier for the teachers to ensure the development of students' intelligent quotient, emotional quotient, social quotient through social interactions, and as well as their physical development and spiritual development. But it is uncertain as to what extent this can be guaranteed in the online blended format. In a traditional classroom environment and in a teacher driven approach, there was greater opportunities available for promoting personality development of the students and to build their characters. But this may not be guaranteed in the online format, and upon that, the lack of digital literacy among students and as well as amongst teachers, and the higher cost involved in adopting technology, and the poor penetration of internet could aggravate the regional income and digital divides, thereby making education less accessible, less equitable, leading to the overall degradation in the quality of education. Hence, to address these concerns, the writers suggest a few recommendations to plug the gaps in the blended learning model. They first call upon the UGC and the Government of India to focus on ensuring accessibility and equity in education. For this, the state needs to enable the teachers, the students, and the institutions to have the right kind of access to technology, that is, to digital devices, and as well as to high speed free internet. The government can make a beginning by providing for high speed and high bandwidth internet across educational institutions for free. This should be followed up with adequate digital training to plug the gaps in digital literacy, and this training would be required for teachers, for students, and as well as for parents. Then, of course, we need to address the teacher student ratio for online classes. In traditional offline classes of higher educational institutions, One teacher would be handling anywhere between 60 to 80 students, but this ratio may not be suitable for online formats of learning because in the online format, a teacher would be required to pay more individual attention to students, and hence there would be a need to recruit more teachers so that adequate and customized attention can be provided to students. Then, of course, the UGC and the government should consider revising the whole curriculum beginning from the school level because throughout schooling, students are used to a teacher driven approach. This is the traditional model followed in offline classes. But all of a sudden, when they enter higher education or when they enter tertiary education, you can't expect them to get adapted to self learning and student driven learning. So, if the curriculum is adequately revised at the school level as well, and if self learning and student driven learning is promoted from the school level itself, it would become easier for the students to adapt to the blended model when they enter higher educational institutions. So the writers feel that without these changes, the blended learning model of the UGC will not work because this model does not align with the core principles of the national education policy. Next, on page number 6, we have a column written by veteran Foreign Affairs editor Suhasini Haidar that deals with the all party meeting that the Prime Minister has called for today over Jammu and Kashmir. We have discussed in previous sessions that the central government has been reaching out to J&K to hold a constructive political dialogue in an attempt to address the political aspirations of Jammu and Kashmir following the revocation of Article 370 and the reorganization of the state into union territory back in 2019. After several months of harsh measures and lack of political outreach by the centre, finally the Prime Minister himself has been making a political outreach towards J&K by calling for an all-party meeting. But as we discussed the other day, the writer also correctly points out that the centre's approach towards J&K could be driven by the security and geopolitical calculations of the region. The centre can no longer afford to ignore the aspirations of Jammu and Kashmir because there are several critical security developments and geopolitical developments that are taking place in the neighborhood. All these developments are going to have a direct impact on the situation in J&K, and this is what explains the centre's latest outreach towards Jammu and Kashmir. The external events which could influence the situation in Jammu and Kashmir includes the ongoing political dialogue between India and Pakistan, which began from February this year. A new dialogue process has begun between India and Pakistan, and a significant improvement in the relationship has been achieved over the last few months. This improvement in the India-Pakistan relationship is a direct result of the ongoing situation in Afghanistan, which we discussed yesterday, and it is also a result of India's ongoing border tensions with China. Because on one hand, India definitely doesn't want to deal with the two-front threat simultaneously, that is the parallel threat posed by Pakistan and China along the border areas. Since China has turned the line of actual control into an active conflict zone, India is very eager to normalize relations with Pakistan in order to prevent the emergence of a two-front theater. Then, due to the developing situation in Afghanistan, there would be pressure on India and Pakistan from the US to normalize their relations and address some of the political questions related to Jammu and Kashmir, because the US definitely wouldn't want any tensions between India and Pakistan, and it wouldn't want the Kashmir situation to have an impact on its critical Afghan policy, where the US has been withdrawing its troops, even at the cost of ceding political space to Taliban. Then, of course, India is also well aware of the criticism that has come in from the Western countries, including from few Western governments, parliaments, and the media, concerning the violation of basic rights of the people of J&K by the centre. All these security and geopolitical related factors are at play, and this has created a need for the central government to reach out to Jammu and Kashmir and hold a constructive political dialogue in order to protect India's domestic and external interests. Otherwise, Indian interests could be severely compromised in the coming months, especially if the situation in Afghanistan were to deteriorate and if the Taliban were to return to power. Parallelly, if we were to deal with a two-front threat from both Pakistan and China, accompanied with Western criticism over the situation of basic rights in J&K, then India would come under tremendous geopolitical pressure, which could lead to compromising our security interests. So, keeping all these factors in mind, the center has opened up a new dialogue with J&K in order to bring back a sense of normalcy to the region. Next, we have another editorial on page number 6 related to the ongoing tensions between US and Iran. Recently, the United States blocked several Iranian websites on the grounds that these websites were promoting disinformation against American interests. The blocking of these Iranian linked websites, followed by their diplomatic standoff over Iran's nuclear weapons program, has increased tensions between the two countries. And in this context, the editorial is suggesting a way forward. See, recently in Iran, presidential elections took place, and a hardline conservative cleric known as Ibrahim Raisi has been elected. In a few months, he is set to replace current President Hassan Rouhani, and Ibrahim Raisi, being a conservative radical cleric, he enjoys the complete blessings of the supreme leader of Iran, that is Ayatollah Al Khamenei. For the United States, the election of Ibrahim Raisi as the president seems to be problematic because it has already placed sanctions against Mr. Ibrahim Raisi for his alleged role in the execution of political prisoners and for violating several human and fundamental rights. So this makes it problematic for the US to engage with the new president-elect. But however, strategic experts have pointed out that since the new president-elect enjoys the blessings of the supreme leader, that is Ayatollah Al Khamenei, it would pave the way for the US to hold substantial talks with Iran, provided if both the sides are willing to make some concessions. See, currently the primary focus of the US-Iran relationship is the ongoing attempts to revive the stalled nuclear talks. Prior to 2015, tensions between US and Iran was extremely high because the US was looking to cripple Iran's nuclear weapons program through the imposition of stifling economic sanctions which had crippled Iranian economy, along with targeted covert operations to disrupt and derail Iran's nuclear weapons pursuit. These tensions had almost brought US and Iran to the brink of war, but these tensions were temporarily resolved in 2015 due to the signing of the JCPOA. JCPOA stands for Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iranian Nuclear Deal, which was worked out between the P5+1 countries, Iran, and the European Union. The P5 countries are nothing but the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and the +1 over here refers to Germany. These countries worked out the deal under which the US had agreed to lift its economic sanctions, which allowed Iranian economy to breathe, and in return, Iran had accepted several restrictions on its nuclear program. The deal essentially marked the end of Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons. For few years, the deal was very helpful in bringing down tensions between US and Iran, but in 2018, US President Donald Trump took a unilateral and controversial decision to withdraw the US from the nuclear deal and reimpose sanctions against Iran. This renewed hostility against Iran by the US led Iran to abandon its commitments under the deal, and it again started enriching uranium in order to produce and develop nuclear weapons. But now, with a change in administration in the US, the Biden government has been looking to make an outreach to Iran to rework the nuclear deal. And the other countries which are still party to the deal, they are helping US and Iran to renegotiate the nuclear talks in the hopes that tensions between the two countries could be brought down. But meanwhile, several roadblocks have emerged to these talks because on one hand, Iran is not ready to scale back its nuclear weapons program, which was restarted after Donald Trump's sanctions. And Iran has placed a precondition that the US has to lift the sanctions first, and only then Iran will proceed with the talks and consider scaling back its nuclear program. But the US is unwilling to make this concession, and the US wants to discuss other issues related to Iran as well, such as its ballistic missiles program and as well as its covert proxy wars in the region. But Iran has rejected these conditions of the United States, and as a result, the nuclear talks have stalled for several weeks. And in this context, the election of a conservative president has caused more concern in the United States. And upon this, the blocking of Iranian linked websites by US on the grounds that they were promoting disinformation leads to further heightening of tensions between the two countries. Hence, the editorial argues that the US should not aggravate any such issues, because if these websites were indeed promoting disinformation, then the US could have easily dealt with them by just promoting the counter narrative, that is, by promoting facts, instead of seeking an outright ban on the websites. According to the editorial, this is unbecoming of a democracy, and if the US is really interested in resuming the talks, then it will have to send out a positive signal towards Iran. The editorial even calls upon Iran to resist employing any aggressive steps against the US, and it is calling upon the Iranian supreme leader and the president elect to clearly display Iran's willingness to come back and accept the terms of the nuclear deal. So, what is needed from both the countries is that they need to stop their hostility towards each other and follow the diplomatic path to work out an amicable solution. Or else, any aggravation or escalation from either of the sides will only push up tensions in the already volatile Middle East region. So, the key to resuming these nuclear talks lies with both the countries. Iran will have to show willingness to scale back its nuclear program and return to the terms of the deal and its commitments, and the US will have to show willingness to lift the crippling economic sanctions against Iran. Now, let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: the Tamil Nadu government's decision to shun the usage of the term central government in its official communications and replace it with union government is a major step towards regaining the consciousness of our constitution. Critically analyze. The second question: evaluate the blended learning model involving a mix of online and offline courses that has been recently proposed by the UGC for higher educational institutions. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.